Come in.
Good evening.
Aran.
It's me, your favorite human podcaster.
Yeah, I know that. It's good to see you. You're looking as, fresh as ever.
It's good to be here.
Have you been sleeping well recently?
I've been sleeping amazingly. I just came back from my holiday in Transylvania.
Wow, I've always wanted to go to Transylvania.
The mountains are beautiful.
You know, I've heard the wine there is really good.
Well, I happened to bring a lovely bottle back for you, my good friend.
Wow.
It has a very metallic taste.
It's so thick and viscous. Say, Aran?
Yes.
Normal human Aran?
That's me, regular Aran.
You know,
same as before.
Normally I know that you come over to my house and we record the podcast, but
yes.
Take a look, it's such a beautiful day out, the sun is shining, the birds are singing. What do you say we go on a little stroll?
You know, I'm actually in kind of a rush. I'd like to wrap this up now. One more thing, before we do, I just want to make one thing very clear.
Uh-huh.
I am not a vampire. Definitely not vampire.
What's a vampire?
You know, a vampire.
I don't know, I think something's getting lost in translation. You know, your voice sounds a bit weird, like...
No, it doesn't. I've always talked like this.
Or is that like a British accent?
Close enough.
Australian?
Oh, fuck you.
Have you been watching a lot of Peppa Pig?
I was watching Bluey. But before we get started, do you know where I could find any virgins?
The feast is o'er, now brimming wine in lordly cup is seen to shine before each eager guest. And silence fills the crowded hall, as deep as when the herald's call thrills in the loyal breast.
Welcome back to the Weird Medieval Guys podcast. I'm Olivia, and this is Aran, a normal human being who walks around outside in the daytime, eats food, and drinks water, just like the rest of us.
Hang on. Hey everybody, it's me. I'm back.
You might have thought, for a moment, during that spectacularly crafted Cole's Open, that Aran had somehow been changed, transformed even, into some sort of undead creature.
What, you were recording that conversation?
However, that was merely a conceit in order to introduce the topic of today's episode. Would you like to introduce it, Aran?
Vampires. We're gonna talk about medieval vampires. We're gonna talk about fake medieval vampires, other fake medieval vampires, real medieval vampire at the end. It's gonna be great.
That's right. This is our Halloween episode, so buckle up, get your mulled wine and your other cozy autumnal accoutrements, and let's go on a journey through medieval vampirism.
Let's get spooky. Now, look, I'm gonna take both Olivia and the listeners back behind the creative curtain for a second and explain why I wanted to do this episode. The reason why I pitched this idea as our first ever Halloween episode was because Olivia has a long-standing love of vampires.
That's right, and one vampire in particular who I think many people might say is their favorite vampire. The
You
one
fucking
and only
poser.
Count, I know, mainstream, the one and only Count Dracula. So there's millions, no, there's not millions. There's hundreds of different iterations and depictions of Dracula, the star of Bram Stoker's late 19th century novel, Dracula. And he's definitely a character who intrigues and entices, as I would say is the vampire as a concept. So there's lots of different versions of vampires out there, just like there's lots of different versions of Dracula.
Some of them are rabbits. Some of them sell chocolate.
That's
Some
right.
of them teach you how to count.
There's Banicula, there's the Count.
I am so glad you know what Banicula is.
Everyone knows what Banicula
Nobody
is.
knows about Banicula.
You're not special. You fucking hipster nerd. This like the standing in the corner meme. No one here knows Banicula.
Yeah, we fucking do. Shut up, bitch.
There's, of course, many adaptations of varying faithfulness of the original novels. So Nosferatu, the German expressionist silent film, is a favorite. You might have seen Francis Ford Coppola's version, in which Keanu Reeves does a less than convincing British accent.
Oi, mister, is we gonna ride on horses? That was about the level of Keanu Reeves' English accent.
That was better. You were less sort of, less limp than he was. And of course, there's the iconic 1931 adaptation starring Bela Lugosi. The film that more or less started and ruined Bela Lugosi's acting career because he could never get cast as anything else again.
Really?
Yes.
That's terrible.
Yes. Actually, if you read about Bela Lugosi, he's a really cool guy who had a really tragic life because he was born in Hungary in, the late 19th century and basically was like a socialist activist and like union leader throughout all of these different sort of periods of social unrest.
Bad time to be a Hungarian union leader in the 20th century.
Yep, and then he moved to the US to start his filmmaking career and he got cast as Dracula, blew up. It was incredibly iconic. And then he could just never get, cast as anything except ambiguously Eastern European monster villain. His career really foundered, and, I don't think he did anything that he took a lot of enjoyment in, film roles-wise, after that, and he got...
That sucks. Why are we starting with a bummer?
A lot of low billing, and then this is, the worst part of the story is when he died, his... I think wife and son had him buried in his Dracula cape, which, he had never requested.
I hope that we're going to talk a lot about reanimation and undead people in this episode. I hope he fucking haunted them for that. That's terrible.
I know. Awful.
A final insult.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ.
Yes.
In lighter news, you mentioned that there was the 1931 film of Dracula, but... As you recently informed me, there are actually 2 1931 films of Dracula.
Well, there's Dracula and then there's Dracula.
Latino Dracula.
There is Latino Dracula. That's right. So if you're not aware of this, in 1931, a Spanish language version of the original Dracula film was made because overdubbing technology wasn't quite what it is now. And so they thought, well, you know what? We've got the whole set up. We've got the studio time booked. Let's bring in a cast of Latina actors and just film an entirely separate Spanish language version of Dracula. Of course, the English language cast was using the set during the day, so this version was filmed at night.
Wait, what? So they didn't I always assumed they did it sequentially.
No, it was filmed at night.
Oh, that's so good.
So every day after English language Dracula had finished filming, the Spanish language cast would come in. The Spanish...
I'm imagining this the scene in Shaun of the Dead where the 2 teams just file past each other and they're identical.
Yeah, and... The director, who did not speak a word of Spanish, by the way...
Vamos!
He was basically filming a shot-for-shot remake with the same script, but translated, and the same camera angles, except that he would actually review the film from that day's shooting on the English version and make adjustments and updates and places where he thought that the film could be improved. He'd make a little improvement. So the Spanish language version actually has... extra scenes added in. And
who wrote the scenes?
I think the director did, or maybe he just, had people come up with stuff where he felt like it was needed.
You there, boy, you speak Spanish. How do you say, I'm not so sure about this dark cave?
Exactly.
Harker.
Yeah.
I'd love to see a movie about the making of that movie.
Absolutely.
Those are in now. You have the Disaster Artist and Mank and stuff.
I've told you about one of my other favorite Dracula movies, which is a movie about the making of the movie Nosferatu, in which the central conceit is that the actor who's been hired to play the vampire is actually a vampire, and he's played by Willem Dafoe, and he's just like a little rat. And it's great. There's a great scene where he's sitting around a campfire with these 2 other guys who are humans, and they're talking to him, and he's giving all of these, really insane vampire answers to their questions. And then he just grabs a bat as it flies past and starts like munching on it, and the guys are like, "Whoa, this actor they got is pretty weird."
Thespians are very strange.
Yeah, basically. And the director of the movie is played by,
You can do
what's
it.
his name? The guy who they go inside in the movie.
What?
John
Honey, I
Malkovich.
Shrunk the Kid. Oh! Being John Malkovich.
Yeah.
The guy they go inside in the other movie.
Well, you know.
Where is his girl who dies on the field?
Let's get terminological, alright? What makes a Dracula... Fuck, no, I'm gonna... it's so tempting.
I know.
What makes a vampire a vampire? How do you distinguish a vampire from a ghost or a ghoul or a zombie?
So there's a few different issues at play here, I would say. First of all, vampire gotta be undead.
Yeah.
So that means a vampire is necessarily corporeal. So it's the body of someone who has died and come back to life. The vampire also is usually characterized by a tendency to drink human blood. So that's an important one as well. And most depictions of vampires also include superhuman abilities, so there's shape-shifting, and there is sometimes mind control, and most often there is a sort of, physical durability. They're very difficult to kill, usually, vampires. And we have different interpretations of how you should kill a vampire. Maybe you need to stake through the heart, or like some silver, or in Twilight you have to cut them up and set them on fire. But usually there's a knack to it. You can't just go in guns blazing.
Yeah. I'd add another sort of... It's not necessarily a sort of necessary criteria, but I think another thing that comes out quite a lot in a lot of depictions of vampires is they're almost always foreign, which you can trace all the way back to, of course, the Transylvanian Count himself, the original Bram Stoker's Dracula. But, like, even in, like, things that are much less directly derivative of Dracula... in terms of a story, there's still this expectation that he's a sort of shadowy foreign nobleman who's sort of preying on the weak-willed, modern, effete elite.
Absolutely. Although, interestingly, it wasn't until the Bela Lugosi adaptation that Dracula actually was portrayed with a foreign accent.
Well, yes, because in the original story, he has perfect English, doesn't he? Which is part of why he's so sort of unnerving.
Yes.
You're like, there's something up with this guy.
I don't know if he is from here.
Where were your parents born again? So...
Lotharingia? Is that in France?
Callback joke. There's going to be a lot of those this time.
Yes. But I think in order to sort of dig into the multiplicity of vampire depictions we have in the present day, we should maybe go back to the Middle Ages and have a little bit of a look at how some of these legends took root in the first place. So have vampires, in sort of the modern sense, the Dracula sense, always existed?
I mean, kind of. It's a bit amorphous. There are definitely legends. There's a lot of stuff that looks and sounds a lot like Dracula in medieval folklore and medieval writing, but either aren't called a vampire or are missing one of those sort of key essential parts of what makes a vampire a vampire. I mean, to take a random example, I was reading a story from a book called Courtier's Follies by a man called Walter Map, a Welsh scholar in the sort of late Middle Ages, and he tells a couple of sort of spooky stories in this book, and I'm sure we'll come back to him. But one of the stories he tells is of this noble family, and they keep trying to have a child, but every time they have a child, the child dies, and on the third attempt. When they've bred a third one, they're like, okay, we're gonna watch it constantly and see what happens, and in doing that, they sort of stumble across the matron of the house who's supposed to be like caring for the baby, slitting its throat, and they're like, what the fuck is going on? Now, a couple things to note here: she's not drinking the blood, and that's a key difference that makes this not a vampire. But they drag her out, they brand her with a cross. She's like, okay, we know who you are. We've got you. And then they're like, wait a minute. This isn't the matron. Because they bring the actual matron, and she's got no idea what's going on. But they bring this woman face to face with this whatever it is that is like looks exactly like her, right down to the branding, but is actually an evil demon, and that's the end of it. So the story ends.
Very
Spooky.
freaky.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I don't know if you read about one of Walter Map's contemporaries, William of Newborough.
I did, yes.
He also recorded quite a few different stories about things that could be considered somewhat akin to vampires, although I think in his version they were referred to as revenants, so remnants in a sense, of people who used to be alive. And these are people who died under some circumstances that were unusual in some sense. So in some cases these were Christians or people who held positions in the church but abused the power that gave them, or people who died without proper burial rites, or even people who died with some sort of unfinished business. So for instance, there was one story he told of a man who walked in on his wife cheating on him with another guy and was so distraught that he fell into fits and died. And what happens with all these different people in the stories is that they come back. Often they come back only at night, but they rise out of their graves and they visit people from their communities, often people who wronged them or people who they have some sort of leftover business with, to horrify them, perhaps even kill them or wound them. And then at the end of the night, they go back into their graves. And what William of Newborough says usually happens with these revenants is that some sort of additional measures need to be applied, where the corpses are dug up out of the ground, and in some cases he says that they were dismembered, or they were beheaded, or they were burnt, or some sort of religious iconography was placed upon them, and then they'd be reburied, and then the visitations would stop.
Yes, and it's very important to note, interestingly, that we talk a lot about different sort of medieval sources and different pieces of writing on this show, and quite often we talk about how you're not always supposed to take it literally. The interesting thing about William of Newborough is that he's 100% being serious, as far as we can tell, because he says stuff like,
I have a quote.
Oh, I think we have the same quote, yeah.
Can you do a William of Newborough voice?
Oh god, what does he sound like? I think he'd be very professorial.
Yeah, he would.
Yeah, he says in this text, he says, "Certainly, the fact that cadavers of the dead, having got out of their graves, should be borne about by I know not what spirit to terrorize or injure the living, would not easily be accepted as true, if there were not so many examples at hand from our own time. And if the testimony were not so abundant, if I wanted to write about every incident of this sort, it'd be too complicated and onerous." So he's basically saying, yeah, I don't know what to tell you, man, it just happens.
You might not believe it, but everyone says it happens, so it must happen.
Yeah, this is very much the equivalent of the sort of a journalist in a major broadsheet paper being like, vampires is real.
Yeah, sort of outside the Anglosphere as well, there are lots of different creatures that resemble the modern vampire in some sense or another.
Yeah, I mean the ground zero for vampires, as far as we can tell, is probably Slavic Eastern Europe. So, and we're about to do something that I think is historiographically not great, which is we're going to talk about folklore in the pre-modern era. So basically, we're going to try and talk about an oral tradition that existed before sort of standardized anthropologies or ethnographies were even a thing, which is bad. Don't do this. But I think there's just enough sources on this in this specific case and enough evidence to make it worthwhile. Anyway, that health warning out of the way, it seems like if you sort of trace the etymology, it seems like vampire comes from a sort of from a Slavic root word, and from the sort of the Slavic mythologies about these undead creatures that sort of rise from the grave to terrorize the living, as you've said. Some of them drink blood, but some of them interestingly don't. So, for example, in the Rus culture, which is the sort of, Slavic Viking hybrid society that sort of gives birth to Russia and Ukraine and Belarus, they don't drink blood. But this is a common theme, and they are sometimes being sort of referred to in language that will evolve into the word vampire, to oversimplify things quite a bit. And interestingly, they are quite specific about how do you make vampire? What's the recipe? So basically, according to old tradition, there's a couple of ways it can happen. So if you die an unclean death, first of all, so if you're a drunkard, a thief, a murderer, if you're unbaptized, people who died from suicide, and if you die if you have too much connection with the living, or a connection to, like, evil spirits, so if you're a witch or a sorcerer or something, vampires all day, mate. So that's the sort of origin myth in huge quotation marks. And one of the things that I think is interesting is that there's a bit of debate about where this comes from originally. Some people say that it's a pre-Christian tradition, but what's interesting is that even if it is, it doesn't fade away.
Yeah.
Post conversion of these communities to Christianity. It's a very powerful idea.
Absolutely, and even Christianity was synthesized into the idea by introducing the notion of someone who's abused, the power or faith of Christianity in their lives could make them more likely to come back as one of these things. And it's a sort of ubiquitous concept as well, isn't it? The idea of some sort of creature coming back.
And coming
death.
back wrong. It's
Yes.
all very Pet Sematary.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, there's a Nordic version called the Draug or
Draugr. Somebody hasn't played Skyrim.
I don't know who, but somebody out there. And that's also a very similar reanimated corpse-like creature that comes back and has magical abilities like shape-shifting. And one thing that I think is really interesting and is kind of a key distinction between the medieval, quote, vampire and the modern vampire is a lot of the folklore is very explicit about these medieval vampires being absolutely disgusting to look at. I mean, these are like, they're not sexy men.
No.
They're bloated corpses that have come back from the grave and are probably leaking fluids, and like maybe bits of them are falling off, and there's probably like a lot of, decay going on.
It's like a smart zombie, basically.
Yeah.
What I think that exemplifies is the fact that this is a notion of vampirism that's very distinct from what we think of now. Like, Bram Stoker kind of creates the modern vampire in Dracula, and he adds the foreignness, the horniness, and the predilection for the sanguine fluid, as it were.
Absolutely, and the kind of ability to blend into human society more or less.
Yeah, because these vampires are coming back and like hitting you with a shovel, but they're not like hanging out. For the most part.
Exactly. They're not seducing your wife.
There are some, that's an overstatement. There are some legends about, like, vampires that are able to come back and sort of blend in a bit. But it's predominantly, it's like, fast, smart zombie that might be able to talk.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you've said before, there are a lot of different traits that we're seeing in different creatures, such as associations with blood, or the idea of something looking like a familiar person but is fundamentally somehow wrong, and something that's come back from the dead. And there's a lot of these traits that appear in folklore, although it is true that before Dracula we don't necessarily see them all together.
Yeah. No, it's a bit like there's a sort of Venn diagram of medieval vampirism.
The vampire spectrum.
It's the vampire spectrum, and you have like one box is like undead, one box is drinks blood, one box is sexy.
Sex appeal, yeah.
Sex appeal. And they don't all like they all sort of exist in these different quadrants, but they aren't necessarily all combined into one. So all these traits that we now think of as definitive wouldn't necessarily have been. Another piece of evidence, and it's a bit of a problematic one, but another piece of evidence that we have for vampiric folk belief is this very strange and very eerie tradition of what are called vampire burials. Now, this category is a bit controversial because it's, you know, I mean, the name is problematic because it's assuming that this is the body of a vampire. It's probably more productive to call them, like, deviant burial, basically. So these deviant burials are places where, you know, the body has been buried, but it's been fucked with in some specific ways. And these show up everywhere. So what I mean is, like, maybe there's metal bars on the coffin. Maybe the corpse has been chained to the bottom of the coffin. Maybe somebody's driven a wooden stake through the heart of the corpse.
Yeah.
Maybe there's cases of people having a rock thrust into their mouth hard enough to break their teeth. Mm-hmm. Like, a lot of this stuff is quite violent and slightly terrifying, and we know pretty confidently this is stuff that's happening to a corpse after burial.
Yeah, there's people with sickle blades around their necks.
Oh, those are so cool.
Holding them to the ground. Yeah, it's pretty insane, and it is seen all over Europe throughout the Middle Ages, although I would say
From Bulgaria to Ireland, yeah.
It's found somewhat more commonly in Eastern Europe, where it seems to have been the norm for quite some time to bury all people in this way. And I think it's definitely, as Aran has said, there are some issues with reading in oh, this is definitely, in every case, a vampire burial. But it is absolutely plausible to imagine that in places where this perhaps wasn't the norm, it was a type of burial that was more commonly given to people who were assumed to carry some risk or some sort of negative juju.
Yeah, well, no,
bad vibes.
This is so interesting. The idea of deviant burials, and not just like quote unquote vampire burials, but any kind of burial that's like outside of the norm, that kind of practice being applied to somebody who is like socially undesirable, is a consistent thread that you see all across the Middle Ages. I was reading this super interesting paper in preparation for this episode about sort of different burial practices for European monarchs. And this is a great data set because they are able to like access pretty much everybody who's ever died in this social class because, you know,
people tended to remember when monarchs died.
Exactly, yeah, and where. Although not always, of course. But like one of the things they found through sort of analyzing these cases statistically is that you had a very high chance of having your having a burial that's in some way deviant, some way like different from Catholic doctrine if you died in an unusual way, so like not sort of in your bed or on the battlefield, and if you were sort of in some way controversial or problematic, or like for example an excommunicate. So a king who had been excommunicated would not receive proper sort of Christian burial. So yeah, it was a way for the living to enforce social norms even after death.
Yeah, sorry I've been making a slightly pained expression. I was kind of anxiously waiting for you to bring up the nipple thing.
Oh god.
Do you know about the nipple thing?
No, I don't know about the nipple thing.
Okay, I need to...
I'm confused and frightened now.
It's a form of deviant burial.
Oh dear. Deviant's the word for it, I'm sure.
Well, yeah, so I think one other type of burial that falls into this category is the bog body. Often what we find with people who have been given a deviant burial in some way or another is also that they may have died a violent death somehow, either by execution or in battle, which I think for a lot of scholars lends a further degree of credibility that these might be people who were being dishonored deliberately by their burial. So this is a bog body of a man who was found in Ireland. This is an Iron Age bog body, so it's not a medieval bog body, but it's an Iron Age man who is estimated to have stood between 6 feet tall and 6'6", which is quite tall.
A Chad.
For for
I mean,
the
it's
Iron
incredibly
Ages.
tall for a modern man, but like, well, not incredibly tall. That's revealing a bit too much about me. But it's unbelievably tall for a pre-modern person, because they weren't getting proper nutrition.
So this bog body, as well as a couple other bog bodies, have been found with their nipples either mutilated or cut off entirely. And so there's a theory that this was a specific type of mutilation that was meant to dishonor kings, or meant to mark a rejected or a dishonored king. I think because of some cultural practice that involved, like, kissing someone's nipples to indicate your deference to them or something like that. But yeah, just a
We've
fun...
come a long way as a species.
Just a fun example of a way in which mutilation of a body has been tied, although not, of course, conclusively, to dishonor.
Yeah. I think what we can learn from the quote-unquote vampire burials in general is that this was, even if not all of them were sort of explicitly tied to vampirism, people are clearly so concerned about what the proper sort of rites to give a body after somebody's died, that it's expressive of some kind of anxiety. And I think we should talk about what kinds of...
Yeah.
Sorry, just so there's you have recipes from the world of Tolkien, and I think
yeah,
that's cool,
Daniels.
but now what I want...
To make some.
That, but also recipes from the world of Redwall.
Aww.
That would be good, wouldn't it?
Recipes from the world of Dracula.
It's very short.
Just like
it's
Grandma's blood.
It's a very short book. It's got 3 pages. And one of them's the foreword. Yeah, so I think we should talk a little bit about the sort of the anxieties and neuroses of medieval people towards these kind of ideas that vampires express. So things like blood and death and happy stuff like that.
Oh, all the best stuff. Absolutely. Yeah. Because, I think what we see in all of these different vampire archetypes is a fear or an anxiety around people returning from the dead.
Yeah.
And also a fear of the living being drained of their life by some sort of unknown monstrous creature.
Yeah.
So I read a really interesting paper on medieval blood as a symbol and a sort of social device, which I found really, really interesting. So of course, blood is, I think, universally quite symbolic to most cultures, and the Middle Ages is, of course, no exception. They were the first culture to associate blood with a lot of heavy symbolism. But of course, blood in Christianity, in particular, has a very specific role.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah,
exactly. So, blood was, in some ways, seen, this is what this paper sort of theorizes, at least, is that blood was seen as the medium that bound together the soul and the body.
Yes.
And that blood is not quite flesh, but also not quite spirit, and that it contains some essence of life or of being or who a person is.
It contains the spiritus, the membrane, which is apparently produced by, they had very particular ideas about where that was produced in the body. They're like, oh no, it's in the left ventricle. That's where the soul
bing,
goes.
Bada boom. Yeah, exactly. And so bloodshed was, of course, very symbolic. So, for instance, in the case of a religious figure or a saint, or especially the man himself, Jesus Christ.
Big J.
Big Jimmy, Greasy Jim.
Slippin' Jimmy.
Oh my God, because Christ means anointed with oil. So, wow. Sorry.
I gotta stop watching that show. It's infecting my brain.
And so, in this sense, to shed blood for these figures was seen as a symbol of kind of the utmost sacrifice and the utmost suffering. And it was believed that these people's blood in the form of a relic, then could possibly impart some sort of magical or divine powers or effects upon someone who carried it around or was in its proximity. So, yeah, it's quite interesting, but then, of course, there's sort of the negative side as well of blood being unwillingly shed, and of something draining you of your blood is then, because blood is seen as such a sort of distillation of the self, then to be drained of one's blood was to be drained not just of one's physical life force, but also of one's spirit.
Yeah, and this, I think, actually brings us to one of the an interesting and slightly macabre, for different reasons, theme of vampirism, which is a lot of people have associated it in the past with anti-Semitism, and that's definitely like the theme of the Jew as a vampire, sort of, you know, sucking the lifeblood of somebody through finance, through usury. That's a thing that comes out constantly in like the 19th and 20th century.
Well, even in you know, Shakespeare, you have Shylock who wants his pound of flesh.
Yeah, and I mean Karl Marx made the comparison. The man himself being Jewish. Not helpful. But anyway, what I think is, and of course there was a huge amount of anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages was inflected with this sort of theme of blood and the consumption of Christian blood being, you know, an important part of Jewish people's satanic rituals. Because again, the premise of medieval anti-Semitism was these are the people who explicitly reject Jesus.
Just like demons.
They had an opportunity and they rejected it, which means they're irredeemably awful.
Yeah, and then we killed him.
You did. I'm still not over it. Anyway, so there were these, especially in the late Middle Ages, these vicious, horrific rumors are sort of end up being spread about like Jewish people like butchering Christian children and baking their blood into matzah for Passover.
Sheesh.
Which is pretty intense, and it leads to a lot of Jewish people getting burned alive. There are entire German villages who kill their entire Jewish population over this. I'm bringing this up because it's evidence of how important sort of blood was in Christian theology, but it's important to sort of note that the connection between anti-Semitism and the vampire myth comes a lot later than I think a lot of people expect. If you want to learn more about that, there's a very good article called "Circumcising Dracula."
Yes,
which is worth it for the title alone, but B contains a really good joke about a Jewish vampire on the first page.
Oh, excellent.
So go check that one out.
Yeah, it's interesting. As a little aside, as a Jewish person myself, who I think is not perceived as Jewish on Twitter on Weird Medieval Guys, I'm mostly sharing Catholic art, which the tradcasts kind of flock to. But actually, I had someone recently send me a message. I posted a picture of a demon that had like green skin and a hooked nose and whatnot, and someone messaged me actually and said, "Oh, you shouldn't post this type of thing because like it's anti-Semitic imagery, and you know, green skin and like a hooked nose, that's anti-Semitic symbols." And I found it really interesting because this person wasn't Jewish, and I definitely respected sort of their, you know, not knowing that I'm Jewish, I respected that they were willing to reach out and sort of engage with that, but actually green skin was not in the Middle Ages, and I don't think ever really properly has been an anti-Semitic trope, and I think that there are a lot of different, not just anti-Semitic, but racist and otherwise discriminatory tropes that we have nowadays. And there's a tendency in history for people to look into history and see things that resemble these tropes and think, oh, this must have been deliberate anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
This must have been deliberate racism. And although people's fears or negative associations with these things can be influenced by their sort of discriminatory mindsets, that doesn't necessarily mean that, like, oh, if you see someone with a hooked nose, that's definitely a Jewish caricature.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's certainly in the case of, like, vampirism, I think that you can say, I don't think you can say that, like, oh, the fear of vampires is about the fear of Jews, because as we've sort of kind of been implying up to this point, a lot the fear that vampires sort of, and the sort of revenants and whatever else you want to call them, represent is a fear of something emerging from within the community, whereas within the Christian community, I should say, whereas a lot of the anti-Semitic sort of tropes in the Middle Ages are about fear of the outsider, the foreigner, the alien, which is, they can be related, but it's a very different kind of fear. I think that, the choice to make Dracula a foreigner in the original novel, even if he doesn't have an accent in the original, is where we get that kind of fusion point. But up until of those kinds of fears of the undead and of the sort of outsider, but up until that point, I think it's probably better to say that like anti-Semitism and vampirism, they sort of emerge in the same world and they are influenced by the same ideas, but they aren't necessarily influencing each other directly.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. And I think that the fear of something malignant emerging from within one's own community is still an equally potent and equally damaging fear.
Another sort of anxiety that I think pretty clearly the vampire myth is helping people to process is the kind of complicated relationship with death. Because I think we have this stereotype in the modern era that life in the Middle Ages was cheap and that death was not really a big deal. But if you actually check like any primary sources, there's really quite moving sort of accounts of grief, and I mean there's a great line that I found from a preacher's handbook, which is brilliant, called Facilius Morum, from the 14th century. This is the quote. "When a human being dies, the body that gave comfort to many people while it was alive provokes horror in the same people after death. Hence the saying, human flesh is viler than a sheep's skin. When a sheep dies, its remains are still worth something. The skin is stretched and written on both sides. When a human being dies, both flesh and bones die." And I think that sort of speaks to, that's expressive of a kind of, this person's not saying that I wish I could make bongos out of my gran, but like.
But what if they were? Okay. Genuine question.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
What kind of book would you want your skin to be turned into?
Ooh, that's good. You go first.
A Warhammer 40k rulebook.
Fuck, that's what. Well, if either of us is gonna get turned into a Warhammer Codex, it's gonna be me. All right.
Oh yeah.
I have the background to back this up.
Well, I just called dibs, so.
Well, I guess it's a race to see who gets there first, huh?
Race to the bottom.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So what I'm getting at here is that people were living with death as a fact of life, but not being like glib about it, which I think we can be when we think about the Middle Ages, like, projecting back. We're just like, oh, everybody just lived and died in shit at the age of 15, and so nothing mattered. And I think one of the things that is really interesting is that medieval culture was quite different, I think, in its relationship with death than a lot of modern cultures are. Like, there's a great quote from Patrick Geary from his book Living with the Dead in the Middle Ages, because he calls death, he says it's not the opposite of life, but it's an age class. So you're an infant, you're a child, you're an adult, you're elderly, you're dead, rather than you're alive or you're dead. It kind of reminds me of, the Bob Dylan song, "I'm on the dark side of the road." Like, it's
Yeah.
What he's saying there is that the living and the dead just kind of coexisted. Like, you just because you were dead, it didn't mean that you lost your you didn't necessarily have a relationship with other people, and you didn't necessarily and that the living didn't necessarily have obligations to you after death.
It's difficult to to prove people's attitudes towards specific things when they're not written down. But some of the first signs of what we consider to be human culture and religious or spiritual belief in the historical record are signs of burials and signs of funerals.
Yeah.
And people taking care of their dead. So I think that you can sort of examine the aspect or the notion of caring about your dead and treating dead people in a certain way until the cows come home, more or less. But I think there will always just be perhaps a sort of immutable core to it, which is that this is just something that people do.
Yeah.
It's important to people.
Yeah. And I think in medieval culture, it was expressed as this sort of, there's this kind of permeability between the world of the living and the world of the dead. You know, there was this idea that, like, you know, you could die a good death or a bad death, and whether or not you did would sort of determine what happened to you afterwards. You could die, you know, you could undergo a temporary death or a more permanent death, and you could die, you know, a partial death.
Yeah.
So a death of the personality without death of the body, and vice versa.
Yes, and of course there's the idea that the soul lives on after death. The idea that, of course, what we experience on Earth isn't final, and perhaps even that what we experience on Earth is just an extended interview for heaven.
Yeah.
But despite that, that doesn't seem to have kept people from being concerned about death and concerned about the body after death. Perhaps this suggests that people weren't always behaving in a, you know, way that they thought guaranteed them entry to heaven.
It's a super complicated subject, and to be honest, this probably deserves its own podcast at the very least. But as it relates to vampirism, the important point to note is that I think what it tells you is that the cultural context was such that people were primed to believe stories about vampires when they heard them, because it'd be like, I mean, that's pretty fucked up, but, like, it's plausible. And interestingly, it was also medically plausible as well. This is fascinating. So we talked a little bit about blood and how blood is this sort of membrane that connects the spirit and the body. And the implications of that were explored by some medieval writers who explicitly said, oh yeah, no, like, you can then, that means that a body, a human body, because it has these physical qualities, therefore it makes it possible for the spirit to come in and puppeteer it. So, for example, in another great manual for preachers by Thomas of Cantimpré, so because when you die, your body sort of remains around and it still has these physical attributes that sort of connect it to a soul, it means that a soul can return and puppeteer it. The body's a little bit like a puppet with, like, strings attached, and, you know, when you die, you just put down the apparatus, and you can come back and pick that up again if you're so choose to, and so can somebody else. So hence why you get stories of, like, demons puppeteering human corpses that we kind of talked about before, or people coming back from the dead to bash their ex-wife in with a shovel. So yeah, the point that I'm trying to make here is that it's plausible. Vampirism would be like, yeah, you could imagine that happening based on how learned medieval people thought about the world.
Of course, yeah, because there's the whole idea that the spirit persists and that the body is more than just, you know, the flesh and blood. So yeah, and I think beyond just the immediate notion of giving a medical justification to something like reanimation or vampirism, I think there's also a very complex psychological issue at play, or psychological reasoning for this. So this gets sort of even more theoretical than our initial medieval vampire discussions did, because although some medieval people were writing down their fears or anxieties or things that they had heard about specific legends and myths and creatures, most people weren't writing down why they thought people experienced these things, or people weren't studying sort of vampires from an anthropological point of view or a sociological point of view, trying to analyze exactly why these creatures were so prevalent in mythology is always going to be very, very theoretical. Something that we can draw on to an extent, perhaps a bit more, is modern folklore, modern mythology, and the creation of modern legends. So, of course, you can't say that modern people think exactly in the same way that medieval people do. But I do think that unless you're willing to die on the hill, that the way people experience sort of fear and like social pressures and anxieties has fundamentally changed over the past 500 or so years, I do think you can draw a bit on like modern sociological studies of how myths and legends about threats have been created and disseminated.
Well, look, I mean, medieval people were different to us, obviously, but, you know, they may have had different inputs, but they're still working with the same hardware.
Yeah, exactly. So it was interesting because I read a paper that differentiated traditional, so to speak, folklore from what we might call an urban legend today by saying that folklore draws on supernatural themes, whereas urban legends draw on just sort of plausible human baseness. So one really good example, I think, of an urban legend is, and this is very topical, Halloween. More specifically, in America, Halloween candy. Strangers are putting rat poison and razor blades in your Halloween
They're
candy.
giving them fentanyl candy.
Specifically to kill them.
Yes.
So this is something that comes up every year.
It has never happened.
Never been
Ever.
substantiated. So the closest instances I could find to this happening, apart from like people who were using it as a cover to target specific children who they knew, was one of the earliest reports of adulterated candy being passed out at Halloween. There was a woman on Long Island who gave, I think, ant poison and steel wool out on Halloween. So the ant poison that she gave out was still in the original wrapper. It had a giant skull and crossbones on it. It said poison.
Ants! Avoid!
And she gave it out to teenagers who she thought were too old to be trick-or-treating, not in a deliberate attempt to harm them, because they're not going to they're teenagers, right? They're not going to open the rat poison and eat it.
She's just like, fuck you.
They're not going to eat the steel wool. She just wanted them to get home and look in their Halloween candy baskets and be like, wow.
She's just a bitch.
Yeah, and she was arrested for this, and I don't think there's any reason to believe she meant to kill anyone. But non sequitur aside, there's never been an instance of someone genuinely trying to kill random children who they don't know by passing out Halloween candy.
So if that's never been substantiated and it doesn't happen, why is this such a prevalent myth?
So this is a myth that you see come up, especially beginning in the 70s and the 80s. And as sort of the second half of the 20th century wore on, concerns about things like stranger danger began to become more prevalent, concerns about random crimes and people targeting children, concerns about Satanism, interestingly, and concerns about things like rises in crime that often came from a sort of suburban white fear about racial integration.
I was about to say, the timeline on that is suspicious, isn't it?
Yes, so this is really interesting because I think you can link it to the same concept of a threat, an unknown threat arising from one's own community. And a lot of papers that I read on this and on similar myths have connected this myth to fears about things that people actually thought could happen. And more specifically, taking the idea of, fears about crime and about stranger danger and racial integration that suburban parents might have had. So this is a myth that's often perpetrated by sort of middle-class suburban parents. And the idea is that they felt an acute sense of collective anxiety about certain issues, but they didn't have a direct sort of threat that they could identify, and therefore lacked a way of addressing and resolving their anxieties.
Yeah.
And so then what happens is a threat is invented, not necessarily deliberately and not maliciously, but people take stories that they've heard and they essentially take them and fit them into their pre-existing ideas of things that are dangerous or things that are threatening. And so they build sort of collectively as this myth is proliferated, and as it develops, it's passed on and it becomes more widespread and thus more solidified, such that any sort of stranger danger that one might hear about, or any instance of, you know, a child feeling unsafe, then becomes subsumed into this overarching greater myth of strangers are passing out poisoned Halloween candy to hurt your children.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting, and especially a second paper that I read tied this into a really interesting study that explored the fact that people who believe in supernatural phenomena will interpret their experiences in the context of that.
Yeah.
So, for instance, I forget exactly what they did in the study, but the idea is, for instance, if someone sees a flashing light in the sky outside while they're trying to go to sleep, someone who, even if there is a rational justification for it, someone who doesn't believe in supernatural phenomena will probably follow that justification and say, oh, it's a plane or it's a helicopter, whereas someone who believes in supernatural phenomena will say, well, it's obviously a UFO.
Yeah.
So it's interesting
And medieval people definitely did believe in supernatural phenomena.
Exactly.
As we've talked about extensively.
Exactly. And so it's really interesting because I think there's a tendency to say, well, this myth arose to explain this phenomenon. And I think it's almost the opposite oftentimes in rigorous sociological studies that I've read, that myths aren't created to explain physical phenomena, they're made to justify sort of anxieties and fears.
So put yourself in the mindset of a, I don't know, let's say 12th century Eastern European villager. You know, you live with, you're trying to process the sort of the enormity of death and what it represents, and at the same time you're getting all these inputs from your local sort of church officials saying it's really bad to, you know, steal and murder and adulter and drink too much and all this stuff. But you have to be a good person, otherwise you're fucked forever. So would it be too crazy under those circumstances to imagine corpses rising from the dead and, you know, butchering your neighbors? I don't think so. I think that's, if anything, a kind of rational response.
Absolutely. And I think there have been, although I again would caution against saying that myths are created directly to explain physical phenomena, there have been discussions of links between vampire or undead mythology and actually what happens to people after they die.
Yeah.
Which,
Well, there's a great... Sorry, do you have a specific...
No,
example?
go ahead.
Well, there's a great example of sort of vampire myths from I think Bohemia, where there's this specific myth about a vampire that sort of rises from the dead by eating its veil. So the wrappings that you wrap a body in when you bury it. So basically, a lot of the time when a body decays, there's this process where the epidermis, it loosens from the dermis, so the skin is like sloughing off of the body. This is, if you have any kids in the room, my God, if you have any I feel like we should edit this back in and say this at the start. This is gonna get grisly. There's some dark shit in this episode, and this is just the start of that. Yeah, so what happens is that, you know, the epidermis loosens from the dermis, and then the fingernails fall off, which exposes nail beds, which makes it look like the fingernails are growing.
The hair as well.
And the hair is growing. At the same time, you know, the corpse is putrefying, so the abdomen is sort of bloating and growing and expanding. And the decay of the gastrointestinal tract contents and lining, what it does, it creates this dark fluid called purge fluid that could actually run out of your nose and mouth. It's grim. Ugh. That might look a bit like dried blood, for example.
Zoinks.
Zoinks. And if a corpse is wrapped in a shroud, putrid gases and purge fluid which flows out of the mouth would moisten the cloth enough that it sort of falls onto the teeth and it looks like it's being chewed.
Yeah, especially because, you have rigor mortis, which is like the tensing of the body after death. So yeah, it's...
And the mouth but after rigor mortis, the mouth opens, which means that the shroud literally falls into the mouth. Yeah, it's grim.
Yeah, it's pretty messed up, I won't lie. And I think it's also important to note that in the Middle Ages, where often there were things like mass burials for plagues, and oftentimes mass graves then had to be reopened after a certain amount of time, and the bones then had to be taken out and put somewhere so you could pile more corpses in. It wouldn't have been uncommon to be reopening old graves.
Yeah, you have to hang out with corpses a lot, unfortunately.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, how do you think all those skeletons got into the Paris catacombs? They didn't cut off all the heads and, stack them together while, they dug up the bones once people had been buried for a while and stacked them neatly.
And I think you're right, though, to say that this isn't necessarily... these natural phenomena didn't necessarily create the core of the myth. Like you say, it's an anxiety it's an expression of a pre-existing social anxiety. But it would probably sure as shit influence the details. So the specific mythology about, this is what the vampire does. Because all that stuff doesn't necessarily have to relate to... It's not prescribed by the social... fear that this myth is expressing is by its definition amorphous and can't be named.
Yes.
So how do you get the details? Probably by looking at a bunch of fucked up corpses.
Yeah, exactly. It is, I think, greatly situational, and that, goes back a bit to what I was saying about this phenomenon of modern legend creation. So specifically this paper I was reading was by someone named Patrick B. Mullen, who props to him for writing an absolute banger of a paper. But he was explaining, so he described legends as a form of collective problem solving, which I thought was a great phrase, because I think it does, when you see a veritable army of wine moms on Facebook being like, how are we going to keep our children from the psychos who are putting fentanyl-laced HIV needles into their Halloween candy? And, they start organizing and delegating, and it is a real community bonding exercise, identifying an unknown non-existent threat and then mobilizing against it. So it's
Salem witchcraft trial.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think you can draw connections between these phenomena. But anyways, what he talked about as well was the ability for a myth to live on in the cultural memory, sort of spanning generations, which is to say that once a myth becomes crystallized as a specific set of attributes, it doesn't, it's still sort of a living thing in a sense, and it's embedded in people's minds, in that then when they see things that they can link back to the myth, then that reawakens the myth of, for instance, the vampire in their minds. So say that because of natural human fears and anxieties and concerns about death and what happens to the soul after death, your culture has pre-existing fears of people, spirits perhaps returning from the dead, and then you have to see something like what we described when you open a grave. Then even if something like, a dead body trying to chew out of its burial shroud or exuding blood isn't necessarily something that's already part of the mythos, then you will see that and connect it in, and it will reawaken and adapt and make you more likely to transmit the myth onwards.
Yeah. And also, I would say that the myth can be sort of reshaped to represent new fears. For example, let's say, a couple hundred years down the line, You're an established imperial power that is sort of starting to go on the down. You've come into contact with all of these new cultures and peoples and languages, and you've dominated them, but they're starting to change you, and they are coming over, literally.
Perhaps.
People. Perhaps perhaps that's a real country.
Perhaps, perhaps you're starting to realize that you can't take infinitely without beginning to give.
Yes. So perhaps in that circumstances, an old figure might be able to give voice to a new fear. But to do that, you need a guy. You need a figure, a face.
Oh my god, it's literally make up a guy and then get mad at him.
That's right. Well, not make up a guy, find an old guy, and then get madder. We gotta talk about the real Dracula. So, the real Dracula.
Ooh.
Yeah, that's right.
So the sun has started to set since we started recording.
And we've not turned any lights on. You have a flashlight that I can hold under my face.
No, but we do have candles.
That seems unsafe.
Do you want me to light some candles?
Let's light some candles.
Where is my lighter? For someone who owns like 25 lighters. Oh, here we go.
That's why you need to own 25.
Yeah, literally.
You just yeeted the fucking candle.
Well, it wasn't lit.
And I'm expecting you to trust you with like a lit flame.
I never said you had to trust me.
Yeah, that's true. Oh, that is... Okay, that actually does add to the ambiance.
It does.
Spooky. Okay, so... The real Dracula. As many of you will know, the name Vlad Dracula was taken from a real guy. Bram Stoker came across a book about southeastern Europe and was like, hey, this guy seems weird. I'm gonna base my vampire on him. It was originally supposed to be Austrian.
Really?
Yeah,
Austrians are scarier.
They are much scarier than Romanians. Romanians are kindly people, whereas the Austrians are frightening. So he takes the name, and it's a bit of an open debate among Dracula scholars as to how much else he takes directly from the real Dracula. I'm of the view quite a lot.
I think he drew on quite a wide body of mythology, though the original Dracula absolutely the most by far.
Yeah.
But I think there were other sources he looked at.
Oh, sure. So let's start actually before the birth of the real Dracula, talking about the etymology of the word Dracula. So, Dracula is the diminutive form of Dracul, which is the old Romanian word for both a dragon and a demon, which makes sense because in sort of medieval worldview they were kind of one and the same entity. To understand how we get to the name Dracula and the guy, we need to go back to the site of a previous episode and pick up on a story that we left off quite a while ago.
You mean this is all happening in the same universe?
This is all happening in the medieval cinematic universe, also known as the real world. Yeah, the real MCU. Those of you who listened to episode 4 will remember the Battle of Nicopolis, a disastrous escapade led by King Sigismund of Hungary. You'll also remember one of our favorite characters of all time, the greatest hater in medieval life, who fought at that battle and experienced it for what it was, which was the biggest bungle in Christian history. That was supposed to start a crusade, and it just didn't, because it went that badly. Named by Conrad Kaiser of Giant Egg, Exploding Cat fame. That guy.
What else did he had like knife with a gun on it? A gun with a knife on it. I forget.
Ladders that have swords on them.
Yeah.
Big fork that you pick up and run at enemies with.
Yeah, like things that you like strap to your horses to make them more destructive.
Scuba suit.
Yes. Yeah.
Giant threshers.
Exactly.
Just
if battle wasn't scary enough already.
Well, he had a terrible time because, of course, the Battle of Nicopolis was a disaster, and the person that he blamed for that was the commanding leader of this crusading army, King Sigismund of Hungary. Now, in the episode 4, we sort of focused on Conrad Kaiser and his banishment from Bohemia and being salty about it.
And subsequent prison literature.
And his wonderful prison literature where he's like mailing it to the Holy Roman Emperor, being like, please fuck this guy up.
I will die mad.
Yeah, he did. But we didn't talk so much about what happened to Sigismund afterwards. Sigismund, after Nicopolis, he went back to Hungary. The whole country's in chaos because everybody's just been like, our king left and he's humiliated himself. So he has a job of work to do to restabilize his rule. And one of the things that he does to do that is create a new knightly order of all of his allies. And do you want to know what the name of that order was?
Yes.
The Order of the Dragon.
Yes!
One of the members of the Order of the Dragon was the Voivode of the Principality of Wallachia. Now, Wallachia is a small, mostly flat country, sort of sandwiched between the Ottoman Empire to the south and Transylvania to the north. It's not hugely... At this stage, it's not hugely famous or notable, except for the fact that later on it will unite with Transylvania and Moldavia to create the modern country of...
Romania.
Bingo! So...
It's about to get put on the map, isn't it?
It is about... Well, yeah, we're gonna get to the guy who does that. So, the Voivode of Wallachia was a guy named Vlad. This is not Dracula. This is Dracula's dad.
Of all of the... I think there's a Dracula's daughter movie from the 30s. There's like...
Son of Dracula.
There's Son of... But Dracula's dad.
Dracula's...
Concept not yet fully explored, I think. So please take it away.
So Dracula's dad is clearly very pleased to have been invited to the big table. Because, I mean, you know, in this region, there are two sort of superpowers, as it were. There's the Kingdom of Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. The Byzantines at this point are wasting away in Constantinople. They're kind of out of the picture at this point. This is, I should say, oh my god, for context, because I didn't set the scene, this is start of the 15th century.
Excellent.
So Constantinople hasn't yet fallen, but the Byzantines are basically out of the picture. The Turks are running rampant to the south, and Hungary is to the north. And Sigismund sets up the Order of the Dragon with the specific aim of fighting the Turks. Now, given his track record of fighting the Turks, I personally wouldn't trust that guy to be in charge of that mission.
No, you wouldn't have been first to sign up, would you?
No, for many reasons. So, Vlad, the Voivode of Wallachia, takes the name Dracul as an honorific to signify that, yeah, that's right, I'm part of the big boys club. I'm an important geopolitical player in 15th century Eastern European politics.
It's every girl's dream.
Yep, exactly. Now, this is where things get horrifically complicated, and I'm going to need you to stick with me, right?
I'll do it.
Because I mentioned the geopolitics of Southeastern Europe, and the geopolitics of Southeastern Europe is horrifically complicated, and the records are terrible, which means that we basically, and everybody has the same name and also three names, so we're going to have to be tread very carefully here. So, after signing up to the all-singing, all-dancing Order of the Dragon, off to fight the Turks, etc., Dracula's dad, well, as soon as Sigismund dies, he switches sides and allies himself with the Ottomans.
Wow.
Yeah.
We're like Vlad the Snake.
Yeah. So Wallachia initially supports an Ottoman invasion of Transylvania, which at this point is a principality that's sort of under the dominion of the Kingdom of Hungary, but switches sides again in 1441, and the Ottoman Sultan, is pretty unimpressed with that behavior.
Yeah, they wrote a song about it, didn't they?
What was that?
You change your mind like a girl.
Like
a
Dracula changes sides.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's how that goes. Anyway, so the Sultan captures Dracula's dad, and also Dracula's dad's sons, including one Vlad the Younger, who will, when he takes the throne, go by the diminutive form of Dracul, which is...
Dracula.
Yeah. So,
So Dracula means little dragon.
Yeah.
Like the rapper. Wow.
That's Dracula's rapper name. So they're captured and taken to the Ottoman court as sort of prisoners / guests. And because the Ottomans they're civilized people. They treat their guests well, as long as they don't fuck up, and then they'll murder them horribly. Dracula's dad gets released because the Sultan is like, okay, I've made my point. But he keeps the sons. He keeps the sons for 8 years. So the young Dracula spends his formative years in the court of the Ottoman Sultan, the court of Murad II, and he hangs out with...
Conrad Kaiser?
Wrong. The other guy from that episode.
Mehmet II.
Mehmet II. Fatih Mehmet himself, the big fucking the weeboo for ancient Greece.
Yes.
The vanquisher of Constantinople.
He's just like me.
So he spends his formative years in the Ottoman court hanging out with Mehmet II. And we have basically no idea what he was doing because, again, these records are terrible. But we do know that 8 years later, in 1448, he's released when his father gets assassinated. And the Ottomans are basically like, well, we don't need these hostages anymore. In fact, not only do they release him, but they give him an army and basically say, you would make an excellent voivode of Wallachia for us. We've trained you. We've raised you, basically. Go and set yourself up as the new voivode in the sort of power vacuum that your father's death has created. However, and he does do that. He becomes the voivode with Ottoman support for 6 months, and then he's deposed.
Oops.
No, don't worry. He'll come back. He flees initially to the Ottoman Empire. In 1456, he tries again. This time with Hungarian support, because again, just everybody's trying to play everybody else off against each other. All the leaders in this story, they're all very sort of Mac in that one episode of It's Always Sunny, where he just sort of loudly announces to everybody, I'm playing both sides so that I always end up on top. That's Dracula. Anyway, so this time he succeeds in 1456 with the backing of the Hungarians. And the first thing that he does, basically, is he invites all the boyars, the great men of Wallachia, to Târgoviște, which is a town in Romania now, for an Easter Sunday feast.
That sounds pleasant and unlikely to go awry.
And normal. Yeah.
I actually don't know what happens next in this story.
Oh, great. Okay, fantastic. Yes, okay.
I can only imagine.
So, as soon as all the nobles are in the room, he bars the doors, and he says, right, you fucking pricks. At least some of you helped assassinate my father. So here's what's going to happen. All of the old boyars, the elderly ones, are impaled on spikes, and the ones who are still young enough to work are stripped of their finery and fucking marched to the side of this hill to rebuild this castle outside of the town of Ponari. And it's a 50-mile trek, and a lot of them die on the way, but the ones who get there are ordered to build him a fortress on the ruins of this old castle overlooking the Arges River. And you want to know what that castle is? That's Castle Dracula.
Castle.
That's the real Castle Dracula. You can still visit it. Anyway.
Wait, but it was made with slave labor? Doesn't that make Dracula like kind of a bad guy?
Nah. This is like
different times.
Yeah. This is a theme that comes up in Romanian history quite a lot, especially during the communist period. There's a little hint of Pol Pot there, I think.
So wait, was he called Vlad the Impaler purely because of the one incident, or was it like serial impalings? Did he impale again?
Oh, Olivia, we're going to get to the... We haven't even got to the thing that makes him become Vlad the Impaler.
Oh, God.
He's not Vlad the Impaler yet. Jesus Christ. You have no idea what's coming. So, here's the interesting thing about that story, though. And, a lot of that story might be apocryphal. There's a lot of legends that sprung up about Dracula after his death. But we do know that something very bad happened to the nobility in the sort of late 1450s. And that old fortress did mysteriously get rebuilt. There was definitely a clearing out and punitive revenge against all the sort of nobility who'd wronged him and his family.
That's very Pol Pot.
It is a bit. Well, it's going to get more so. The interesting thing about that, though, is that cleared out the old elite. It meant that Dracula could then install a new elite who were loyal to him, which made him far more powerful within the boundaries of his own state than a medieval ruler typically would be, because a medieval ruler is constantly having to negotiate with all these different other power brokers.
Wow.
Yeah, and in the case of Vlad Dracula, that's tremendously bad news if you're Wallachian, because this guy's a fucking psychopath. He's insane. I'm sorry. I'm going on a tangent here for a second, but almost always when we do this show, and I research like a specific guy, I have like a real like pathos for them and liking for them by the end. I hate this guy. He's insane. He's terrifying. And we haven't even gotten into why yet. So, he was famous for his brutal punishment techniques. He would order people to be skinned, boiled, decapitated, blinded, strangled, hanged, burned, roasted, hacked, nailed, buried alive, stabbed, etc. Not always all the same time, obviously.
That would be quite
Too
many cooks and whatnot, wouldn't you say?
But his favorite method of execution was impalement, which is why he gained the title of Tepes, which is impaler in Romanian, and even the Turks called him Kaziglu Bey, which means the Impaler Prince. Ooh. Yeah, I know. So he did that in 1457, 1459, and 1460 against Transylvanian nobles and merchants who didn't follow his trade laws. You know, he's terrifying. Let's get to the main impaling, right? So eventually, in 1461, for no obvious reason that I can divine, he decides to invade the Ottoman Empire. This is the thing about him. He's an absolute live wire. He's a loose cannon. He just does shit. He basically went up to a giant bear, didn't poke it, whacked it with a stick, and said, "Fuck you." By this point, the Ottoman Emperor is Mehmet II, the guy who he grew up with, which is fascinating and, you know,
Daddy issues.
Well, a lot of people have sort of drawn out that kind of relationship, and it is fascinating to think about. Unfortunately, we have basically no idea of what their personal relationship was. And, you know, the household of an Ottoman Sultan was so enormous that they might not have ever even met. But what if they did?
And even if they hadn't, growing up in this guy's court would definitely give you some type of feeling, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
If you'd been separated from your father and what you perceived to be your birthright.
This guy's got issues. He's got problems.
God, what an interesting guy.
We're not even... Oh my god. Okay, so...
Oh, boy.
We're getting to the climax now, though.
All right.
So...
Hit me with it.
So, Mehmet II... Again, this is not a guy who you want to fuck with. He's the guy who ended the Roman Empire.
So cool.
Like, he's a very effective general, a very powerful ruler of one of the largest states in the world. Terrifying thing to do. So, Mehmet personally brings his army north to stamp out this bug that's bothering him. And he comes across one of the most fucked up things that's ever happened in history, I think.
To any of our listeners, right now we're sitting in like a mostly dark room, and the only source of illumination is our laptops.
And one candle.
Solitary lavender-scented candle that was sent to me by my aunt for my 23rd birthday. So
woo! It's very atmospheric in here.
I highly recommend a sort of equivalent or similar experience.
Oh yeah, this is to be experienced in the dark. Don't be
listening to this on the subway, okay?
No.
We're gonna know if you do.
Well, maybe the subway at like 2 a.m. That has a similar vibe to this story. So, Mehmet's army sort of rampages north, and he's brought, by the way, I should say Mehmet has brought Vlad's younger brother Radu with him, who has also been groomed as like he's groomed as like a puppet ruler to install. And he marches all the way to Targovište, which is the capital of Wallachia. But when he gets there, he finds it undefended. There's nobody in the city. But there are some people outside of the city. And this next part comes from a Greek Byzantine scholar who was sort of implanted in the court of Mehmed II as a sort of historian. And he describes how when the Turkish army reaches the capital, they find it surrounded by a forest of the impaled. Thousands and thousands of corpses impaled on stakes. And this is what he says. The Sultan's army entered into the area of the impalements, which was 17 stadies long and 7 stadies wide. There were large stakes there, on which, as it was said, about 20,000 men, women, and children had been spitted, quite a sight for the Turks and the Sultan himself. The Sultan was seized with amazement and said it was not possible to deprive of his country a man who had done such great deeds, who had such a diabolical understanding of how to govern his realm and its people. And he said that a man who had done such things was worth much. The rest of the Turks were dumbfounded when they saw the multitude of men on the stakes. There were infants too, affixed to their mothers on the stakes, and birds had made their nests in their entrails.
I love the idea of rocking up to the forest of impalements. Like, hell yeah! Who did this?
He seems cool.
My compliments to the chef.
I mean, Mehmet did... I personally think that the author is taking some license with Mehmet's reaction, because Mehmet does then just basically go home and say, fuck this. Like, what he's saying here is basically saying, like, you know what? This guy is insane. Fuck this. Fuck all of you. I'm out of here. Radu, you handle this. I'm going home to Constantinople, where people are normal. People don't get impaled on spikes.
A couple years ago, I went to the Barbican Theater with my boyfriend and watched Jordan Peele's movie Nope.
Yeah. Good movie.
In which sort of, I think, the
not that scene. Oh, God.
Oh, no, I was just thinking about the part where he's in the car and he sees the monster and he's just like, nope. And rolls up the windows.
Well, that's literally what, that's what Mehmet was saying. He's just like, this guy is not worth it.
Yeah. Fair enough, man. Fair enough.
Yeah, anyway, the rest of Vlad's life is, he gets deposed by his brother. He flees to Hungary, where they imprison him again for a bit.
Yeah, good.
And then they're like, actually, no, you can go back, because he's a useful tool.
Or you Vlad the Impaler of the impalings.
of the Valachian impalers. Yeah, so and then they basically release him like an attack dog later, and he sort of goes back and rules again very briefly. And then he dies eventually on campaign. That's the end of Vlad the Impaler. That's the life of Vlad. After his death, Wallachia becomes pretty definitively a vassal of the Ottoman Empire for basically until the 19th century. But he does get remembered. He's remembered actually surprisingly fondly in Romanian national folklore as a ruler who was, yes, brutal, but just and got results. There's one legend that's almost certainly not true, where they said that, like, in the town of Targovista there was a golden cup that was left completely unattended in the center of the stage, and no one ever stole it, because they knew that if they did, Vlad Dracula would find them.
Oh dear.
Yeah. And by the way, I should say, he's also, like, there are pamphlets in Germany being written about this guy in his lifetime. He's already becoming a sort of horror icon in his lifetime. But then he grows to become this kind of, like, Robin Hood-esque figure. Because he did fuck with rich people.
Yeah.
And that's a useful thing for lots of different political movements to reference. Anyway, so... But he does kind of fade out of the Western popular imagination for quite a long time, until the late 19th century. Now, we mentioned in a sort of glib way the social context of the British Empire in the lifetime of Bram Stoker, but I think it's also important to understand the geopolitics of Southern and Eastern Europe in that period, because this is a time when the Ottoman Empire, after having been, the predominant power for centuries, their influence in Europe is fading away. It's not like people call this the sick man of Europe myth is overdone, but it is fair to say that in this period, Ottoman power is kind of, it's just receding like a tide, very slowly. And one of the things that happens with that is that these provinces that have been Ottoman vassals for hundreds of years are returning to the European world. It's like the analogy I would draw is it's sort of like post-1991 Eastern Europe kind of returning from the foreign power of the East. And that's something that people are processing in the context of Britain's own imperial sort of slowdown and decline across the world, and the sort of increasing prevalence of non-white, non-Christian, non-English-speaking people in British affairs. And so these things are happening simultaneously. A lot of scholars have made the point that the fictional Dracula represents the return of the repressed, the primitive, barbaric, fearful past, returning to menace the civilized world through the reemergence and a sort of recontact with foreign societies, basically.
Like he washes up on your shore and sucks your ladies dry, you know.
Exactly. Exactly.
He's malignant.
This is, shall we say, problematic.
Absolutely.
From a modern person, but like,
it's fascinating because it is, I think, one of the first times that the vampire as like a mythological creature isn't necessarily associated directly with death and fear of death. And, you know, in the sort of fear is no longer fear of something within the community, something personal, but rather fear of the unknown and fear of foreign intrusion.
Which is also how how Jews get mixed up in all of this as well. It metastasizes.
Yeah.
And Dracula is the perfect character to do that because he is terrifying. He is a horrific character in real life. You don't really need to do that much. So yeah, he is the part of European history that modern Europe has chosen to forget, returning to menace them. The ultimate medieval vampire.
Yeah, and as well sort of deeply wrapped up in the author's own fears and anxieties. So I think it is absolutely a form of what one might call collective problem solving, in that it's Dracula as a character is a manifestation of these fears of like foreign intrusion and fears of the unknown. And also there's a deeply personal component as well, and it's sort of hard to know what angle to approach this from, because I do think that, you know, I don't mean to sort of arbitrarily read modern meaning into a Victorian work. And so when people say things like, oh, queering the Dracula narrative, I think a lot of people's first impression of something like that can be, oh, they're trying to make Dracula gay.
Dracula's always been gay.
Because, you know, now in the...
You think him and Mehmet II weren't getting it on?
Because now in the modern times, the trend is to make everything gay. So now we have to make Dracula gay.
Dracula's gone woke.
So Bram Stoker himself, who wrote Dracula, is a really interesting guy. We don't know a lot about his personal life and his sexuality. So, yeah, Bram Stoker was married once, but rather unhappily, and it's been speculated, in fact, that he might have been gay. Sort of the main things that people point to are his correspondence with the American poet Walt Whitman, who was very gay, and Bram Stoker, and very openly so. This is not disputed, and Bram Stoker essentially wrote Walt Whitman all these letters, saying things to the effect of, oh, I admire you so much for your honesty and your courage. You've been able to vocalize that which I have never been able to.
Oh, come on.
So I don't think it's hardly subversive, and it's hardly new to read into this that Bram Stoker himself might have also been gay or experienced same-sex attraction, especially in light of the fact that he began writing Dracula 1 month after the conclusion of Oscar Wilde's trial.
Fuck!
For public indecency.
Really?
Yes.
Oh my god.
And so the Dracula narrative, which consists of this, sophisticated older man preying upon a younger, sort of helpless man, it has been interpreted as sort of an externalization of Bram Stoker's own fears and anxieties surrounding his own sexuality, and perhaps a wish to not feel this sort of this difference between himself and the people around him, but also his immense fear at what might transpire and how he might be perceived if he were to be open about this aspect of himself.
God damn.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think to wrap it up, we've talked about vampires and people who either contributed to the vampire mythos by being sort of horrible creatures in their own lives, or who wrote...
So glad I got to tell you that story, because it's one of the best.
Oh, it's frightening. Or people who wrote about vampires. But I think, for me, the overarching theme that kind of binds this together is this mythologization of the vampire and of folklore in general as a mirror of human anxieties and undercurrents in human society. This is, people were intelligent and were adaptive and were able to take sort of the substrate of folklore and mythology and turn it into whatever we need it to be in order to justify our fears and our concerns and our baser impulses. And I think the vampire is an absolutely amazing encapsulation of that.
To me, all of this, the myths of vampirism and the story of Dracula and all that stuff, it's kind of, I think it speaks to the sort of the place where the psychological and the social kind of meet and do fucked up stuff. Like everybody's dealing with stuff, whether it's Bram Stoker dealing with his possible same-sex attraction, whether it's the real Dracula processing his very obvious and thinly veiled trauma and horrific life experiences by inflicting horrific pain on his people, or just a villager in 10th century Rus, like processing what death means. These myths are a way that we as a society make the personal social.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very succinct way of putting it.
Never in danger,
There's just one more thing we have to deal with, Olivia, before I let you go. Ooh. You see, I fooled you. I am not Aran at all. I am Count Dracula.
Oh dear.
I have brought you under my spell, and now I will drink your blood. The fuck is going on in here? What is it? Why are you hanging out with Dracula?
Aran? Wait, but I thought he was Aran.
That's my roommate, Dracula. Look, it's London, all right? Sometimes you don't get to live with the people you want to live with, okay? Dracula, what are you doing?
It seems like you and Dracula have a very close relationship, though.
What are you implying? There's nothing going on there. We're just roommates. Listen, you always get to go on the podcast. I wanted to join in. I heard you were doing an episode about vampires, and I thought, who's more qualified to do this episode?
Listen, Dracula.
Yes?
You're valid. We're happy to have you here.
Oh, so I don't have to, enchant you or anything?
No, absolutely not.
No, Matt, you can just come over. It's fine.
Yeah, totally. I wanted to ask, I've been seeing this therapist, and, I know you've got some sort of, unhealed trauma from everything that happened.
I've got a lot of stuff going on.
In your childhood, and, I was thinking maybe, you might want to go and, talk to this guy. He's really good, and, I found sessions with him to be really rewarding.
Oh, yeah. What's his name?
He's a very respected psychiatrist. His name is Dr. Van Helsing.
Alright, Dracula's gone, so we can wrap up the podcast. Yeah, thanks so much for sticking with us in this episode of the Weird Medieval Guys podcast. It was a bit of a dark one, but it is Halloween. The nights are fair drawn in these days. I hope you enjoyed our spooky deep dive into death and blood and horror and all that sort of lovely stuff.
All the best stuff. And, as always, just a reminder, I've got a book coming out. It's in about 3 weeks now that you can get yourself a copy of the Weird Medieval Guys book, but it's not too late to pre-order it too. You can make sure it gets delivered directly to you as quickly as possible.
It's a fabulous little thing.
It's a great book, and if you're not stupid, you will go and order it right now. It's called Weird Medieval Guys.
If you have even a passing interest in the Twitter account or the podcast or anything,
a sliver of self-respect.
This is that, but more.
Exactly.
And,
better.
Yeah, I don't want to say
better, faster, stronger.
All right, let's bring it home, Daft Punk.
All right. Well, as always, please do leave us a review. If you like 5 stars, please give us a 5-star review, and feel free to let us know your thoughts in your review or in the Spotify advice box. We actually have some reviews from last time that we might like to read out loud. This is on What's the Deal with Jesters? Someone said, I hope there will be jesters at the WMG theme park. There is no WMG theme park, silly. This is from
Not yet.
Dennis Long. A couple people have requested more jokes about Florence, which I don't know what that says about the Florentines, but this review finishes, I love the donkey joke and would love to hear more of that guy's material, also more jokes about Florence.
Well, I've got good news for you, because next episode, we're doing Florence.
Yes!
A deep dive. You're going to know what a gonfaloniere di giustizia is by the time we're finished with you.
But I also have some more, I have another Nasruddin joke to read out to you for our,
Turkey number 1.
So previously on Substack, I wrote a post about medieval Islam and Islam in general and their relationship with cats. And
link in the description.
And here's a good Nasruddin joke about cats. So, after the Hodja got a liver recipe from his friend, he bought some liver. Nasruddin loved liver and he wanted to eat it very often. But every time he bought liver, he couldn't because his wife said the cat took the liver and fled away. One day the Hodja became very angry and said, Woman, I bought liver. Where is it? Oh, said his wife, the silly cat took it and fled away. At this same time, the cat was in the room. The Hodja caught it, brought a steelyard, and weighed the cat. Then he said, That is exactly 2 kilos, and the liver which I brought was also 2 kilos. Now tell me, if that is the liver, then where is my cat? And if that is the cat, then I want my liver. Classic Nasruddin.
He's at it again.
Yeah.
So yeah, where can people find you, Olivia?
You can find me on Twitter at Weird Medieval or my personal account at Olivia__MS. Aran, I believe you're also on Twitter.
I am on Twitter. I'm at Aran ARAN P Tappers. I'm not calling it X. I'm never calling it X.
No.
It's Twitter.
That's
till
right.
the day Twitter till I die.
Exactly. Twitter
and then come back as a vengeful revenant.
I was gonna say Twitter till the day I get impaled on a stick.
That too.
All right. Well, on that happy note, happy Halloween. Keep it spooky, and see you guys next time.
Take it breezy.
Let us then through ourselves where we are rolling on gentle Doran, we strike